The National Institute of Mental Health estimates that 1 in 4 Americans suffer from some form of mental illness: depression, drug and alcohol abuse, schizophrenia. In Montana, that works out to be around 250,000 people. But right now, only a fraction are getting the help they need. In tonight's special report, the News Channel's Casey Joyce shows us why.
Mental illness isn't something people like to talk about. If you were physically sick and suffering from, say, cancer, friends and family would rush forward to be supportive. But an illness like schizophrenia is a lonely and secret battle.
No one wonders if you break a bone or if you have heart disease about what does that mean. It doesn't have the stigma attached to it.
Even the words mentally ill can conjure up visions of insane asylums, sedated people in straitjackets, or horrible tragedies like the Virginia Tech or Columbine shootings. But the truth is, mental illness is rarely that extreme.
Mental illnesses are the most disabling. It's the leading cause of disability in this country.
Odds are right now, you or someone you know is living with some form of mental illness. Now there is help, but here in Montana, getting that help isn't easy.
It's not an issue that they don't receive good care once they get there. The issue is access to the care.
The result? Montanans are slipping through the cracks. For years, Gary Popeil says he had the perfect Disneyland family. His daughters Nicole and Allie were smart, beautiful, and driven, but both were also tormented by mental illness. For 15 years, Gary tried to get the girls the help they needed, but he had no idea what to do.
It's a do-it-yourself kit without instructions. It's just your life's in a turmoil. You don't know where to turn. You don't know where to go.
The girls went through treatment centers in Missoula and Helena and started seeing psychiatrists. But in 2000, when she was just 29 years old, Nicole took her life. 6 months later, Allie wrote a suicide letter and tried to drive off the Highlight Dam. She survived, but was never the same.
But we both have, gone through a lot of pain, and both emotionally and physically. But it isn't 1/100th the pain that both my daughters suffered every day.
On Father's Day in 2002, Gary's wife Vicki and Allie got into a serious car accident. Vicki was paralyzed and Allie was brain dead. The doctors couldn't save her. She died 6 hours later.
No parent ever wants to outlive their child. And to have lost both of my children and my wife's and I's children it's just unfathomable.
Gary calls his girls his beautiful minds. They were brilliant but tormented. And here in Montana, Gary says they didn't get the help they so desperately needed.
If we would have had facilities here versus there, maybe my oldest daughter wouldn't have taken her life.
Montana has only 55 psychiatrists across the entire state. And despite the fact that Montana has the 3rd highest suicide rate in the country, most communities can't handle suicidal people or those going through a mental crisis. So when things start to fall apart, it's often the police who find themselves on the front lines.
Even though we're not trained in it, we're supposed to know a little bit about everything.
Last February, the sound of gunshots jolted people in the South Hills neighborhood from their sleep. They called 911. The suspect was a man who had been living with relatives in the area. Officers arrived and realized he was mentally ill, so they took him to St. Patrick Hospital for a mental evaluation. It was supposed to last 72 hours, but the next morning, he was back on the streets.
Well, we had done our job as law enforcement. We had got him to the place where he needed to get the help. And I felt, and over the years, it's been, there's been several different situations where we take them to the hospital, and it seems like they're out before the 72-hour commit. It seems like a lot of times they don't even actually see a mental health professional.
The story doesn't end there. The 911 calls continued. These court documents are full of pages and pages of complaints from his neighbors.
He has threatened to kill the owner of the golf course.
We're concerned for the safety of our children.
His presence in the neighborhood is terrifying.
In May, police picked him up again for carrying an assault rifle through the neighborhood. The judge sent him to Warm Springs for 90 days, but he was only there for 3 weeks. 3 days after his release, he was picked up again for being drunk and assaulting a neighbor. The judge sent him back to Warm Springs. Now, while he was at Warm Springs for the second time, people in this quiet South Hill neighborhood were still concerned. They went and got a restraining order, and now that man is prohibited from coming within 1,500 feet of the neighborhood and the golf course. Police still get calls to the neighborhood, but the man is now living in temporary housing across town. Even so, his neighbors are still worried. Some would like to see him locked up, but detectives say jail isn't the answer.
Jail is not a deterrent, and in this case here specifically, it wouldn't do him any good. It wouldn't sure it'd make the neighbors safer because he'd be locked up, but it wouldn't be doing him any good, and so we'd be doing him a disservice at that point.
Cases like this aren't uncommon. In fact, they happen more often and with more drama than ever before. And police are stuck in the middle, left to decide whether or not to criminalize the mentally ill. But even with mental help, things can still go wrong. Back in the 1950s, the Montana State Hospital housed over 2,000 people. But a lot has changed since then, including the development of community programs and medications to treat the mentally ill. In the 1980s, President Ronald Reagan made a push to deinstitutionalize the mentally ill and get them back into society. Now, the hospital only houses 189 people, but it's still well above capacity. On the day we visited, there were 208 patients at the hospital. The average stay is only 55 days. Some patients get the help they need and return to their communities to live normal lives. But unfortunately, that isn't always the case. In 1996, a Helena judge sent Russell Weston to the state hospital for threatening an emergency room worker. Earlier that year, Weston also made threats against then President Clinton. At Warm Springs, he did well during treatment and started taking his medication. He only spent 53 days at the hospital and was released because doctors said as long as he was on his medication, he was no longer a threat.
He stabilized like most people do, and there was no reason to keep him here longer.
After the staff here at Warm Springs released Weston, they made arrangements for him to get follow-up care near his parents' home in Illinois. But as soon as he realized that that care wasn't mandatory, he stopped going. A year and a half later, Weston went out to Washington, D.C. and gunned down 2 Capitol police officers. At Warm Springs, news of the shooting was particularly hard to hear.
It hurts. It's traumatic for the people that have worked with a person. It's stigmatizing for other people with mental illness.
Amberg says there's not much they could have done differently in Weston's case. He had a good discharge plan and they released him to his family. But in the end, it wasn't enough. In Helena, at the State Department of Addictive and Mental Disorders, Joyce DeCunzo is trying to make the system better by attracting more psychiatrists to Montana.
We're putting a hard punch, I guess, on trying to develop some of the kinds of services that people tell us they need.
Part of her plan also includes developing more short-term crisis centers to help people when they need it most. 2 years ago, Billings opened the first crisis center in the state. Its goal? To provide immediate mental health care to suicidal people and those going through a mental crisis. Gary Popeil says it's exactly what Montana needs.
You could reduce suicides and help the mentally ill dramatically if you had crisis facilities in communities and not 140 to 200, 300 miles away.
Gary is just one of the countless mental health advocates across the state who are passionate about trying to fix the system. He knows all too well what can happen when it fails, but he also knows it isn't an easy fix.
It's like standing under Niagara Falls with the cork and you're trying to plug it. It's that big. And so where do you start?
Casey Joyce putting that special report for us together. Casey, why has this become such a monumental problem in Montana?
Well, Heidi, it's just such a widespread issue, and it just doesn't get the attention that something like cancer or other big diseases does because it's got that stigma that we talked about. It's, you know, if you broke your leg or if something happened, if you had cancer, you would go and you would get help right away. But with something like mental health, there's just that stigma on it, so people don't like talking about it. It's hard to get help. And there's also a mentality that if you just persevere and you try hard enough, that maybe you can just get better on your own. And in a lot of cases, that's just not true.
And is there anything coming into place here to improve the situation?
In fact, yeah, there is. Montana's actually pretty lucky. The last legislature actually gave a lot of money to mental health, and so they're going to do a lot in the next coming years to try and help the mental health program here in Montana. One of the things that they're really concentrating on, we touched a little bit on, is the psychiatrists. They're going to try and bring more psychiatrists to Montana, and that's actually come out today as being a very important thing. There was a study released by the Mental Health America Association, and they said that the states that have more psychiatrists have actually lower cases of suicide. And with Montana being the third highest suicide rate in the country, that's obviously a very big deal.
Well, thank you so much for addressing this for us. A very important issue for our state. We do want to get some resources for folks. If you or someone you love is living with mental illness, we put together some resources on our website. Go to NBCMontana.com, click on the Mental Health FAST link on the left of your screen. There is also a FAST link for NAMI, that is the National Alliance on Mentally Ill. They have chapters throughout the state, and they do provide support and guidance for the mentally ill and their families.